The East End of London in 1888 was frankly a dire place to live. Its overcrowded occupants lived a hand-to-mouth existence in dank, filthy streets where violence was commonplace. Anyone would be forgiven for thinking that things couldn't get any worse, but between the 31st of August and the 9th of November 1888, the more dignified parts of London, England, and the world looked on with fascination and horror in equal measure, as women in London's East End became terrorised by a serial murderer, Jack the Ripper. On the 31st of August 1888, a man by the name of Charles Cross, who was making his way to work, came upon the body of a woman lying in Bucks Row. Her skirts were pulled up around her waist, and although her face was warm, her hands were cold. Cross called over another man, Robert Paul, who was also making his way to work. Cross believed that the woman was dead, but Paul believed she was still alive. However, neither of them wanted to be late for work, and so rather than try to help her, they pulled down her skirts and agreed that they would report the findings to the first police officer that they came across. Paul would eventually come across a policeman and report his findings, but before he did, at 4 a.m. in the morning, a PC John Neal, walking his beat, found her first. PC Neal summoned a local doctor, a Dr. Llewellyn, who attended the scene and pronounced her dead, although only recently. The woman was later identified in the mortuary as Polly Nichols by her friend Polly Monk, and this identification was confirmed by Polly's husband, William Nichols, her father, Edward Walker, and her son, Edward Nichols. The inquest into Polly's death began on the 1st of September 1888. Polly's friend Emily Holland testified that she had last seen Polly alive the night before on the corner of Whitechapel Street. She said that she was very drunk and was out to earn her DOS money for a bed for the night. Dr. Llewellyn, who had attended the scene and had also performed the post-mortem, also gave evidence. Now, I find this next part uncomfortable because even though it's known that the women suffered mutilations after the death, I don't tend to look at what these mutilations actually were. I know that they were there. I don't pay attention to the detail. I think of the case as a whole. So I am going to describe the testimony given by the doctors, just for the sake of completeness. I won't describe it all, and I won't go into it in future videos because I don't think it needs to be repeated. So if you're a bit squeamish, just skip over this part. Dr. Llewellyn testified that there was a bruise running along the lower part of the jaw on the right side of the face, which may have been caused by a fist or pressure from a thumb. There was a circular bruise on the left side of the face, which also might have been inflicted by the pressures of the finger, and it was also suggested that Polly may have been throttled first. Dr. Llewellyn confirmed a 4-inch incision over the left side of the neck, about 1 inch below the jaw, running from a point immediately below the ear. An inch below there was a circular incision about 8 inches in length, ending about 3 inches below the right jaw, severing the large vessels of the neck on both sides, and had completely severed all the tissues down to the vertebra. He thought that the cuts had been caused by a moderately sharp, long-bladed knife and used with great violence. There were no injuries about the body until the lower part of the abdomen. A very deep, jagged wound had cut the tissues through, which began 2 or 3 inches from the left side. There were several incisions running across the abdomen, and 3 or 4 similar cuts running downwards on the right side, all of which had been caused by a knife which had been used violently and downwards. He testified that the injuries were inflicted from left to right and might have been done by a left-handed person, and that the same knife had been used to inflict all of the injuries. The cause of death given on Polly's death certificate is syncope due to hemorrhage caused by the severance of the carotid arteries, and syncope or syncope, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. That's the medical term for loss of consciousness, fainting and passing out. So Polly Nichols is generally considered to be the first victim of Jack the Ripper, although that nickname hadn't yet been used. And at the time, the police and the newspapers linked Polly's murder to 2 other murders that had happened earlier that year, that of Emma Elizabeth Smith in April 1888 and that of Martha Tabram or Martha Turner just a few weeks earlier on the 7th of August 1888. So as this was now assumed to be the third in a series of murders, newspapers were interested and the public interest began to grow. Rumours spread that the murderer was a local Jew, Leather Apron, who carried a knife and bullied prostitutes. A man by the name of John Pizer, who made leather footwear and was also known as Leather Apron, was brought in for questioning by the police on the 10th of September 1888. A search of his house found several long-bladed knives. However, he was released based on an alibi for the time of the murder. And a leatherworker you would expect would have several long-bladed knives, so that might not be relevant. On the 8th of September 1888, a man named John Davis, resident at Hanbury Street, went outside and noticed the body of a woman lying just outside the yard at approximately 6 a.m. The woman was clearly not alive. So Davis attracted the attention of 3 other men, James Green, James Kent and Henry Holland, who quickly went to find a policeman. So the police attended, as did police surgeon George Bagster Phillips, and he pronounced this woman dead at approximately 6:30 a.m. And he quickly linked this murder to the one before of Polly Nichols. And this woman was identified as 47-year-old Annie Chapman by her younger brother Fontaine Smith, who was said never to have been the same after that. The inquest into Annie's death began on the 10th of September 1888. Timothy Donovan testified that, like Polly, Annie had gone out in the night to earn money to pay for her bed for the night. And again, the doctor who attended the scene and performed the post-mortem, this time George Bagster Phillips, testified. So he testified that the throat was deeply severed with a jagged incision from left to right, reaching right around the neck, and so deeply that the vertebral bones had striations. She had a protruding tongue and swollen face, which led Dr. Phillips to believe that she may have been asphyxiated with the handkerchief noted to have been tied around her neck before her throat was cut, and that her murderer had held her chin in place as he did so. She had been disemboweled. A section of flesh from her stomach had been placed upon her left shoulder, and another section of skin and flesh, plus her small intestines, placed above her right shoulder. Part of her uterus and bladder was missing. One instrument, a very sharp knife with a thin narrow blade of at least 6 to 8 inches, perhaps that used for a post-mortem or by slaughtermen, had been used for all injuries inflicted, and he stated that there was some anatomical knowledge. He also testified that as there was no evidence of any struggle and no blood trail in the yard, that she had entered the yard alive and of her own volition. And the cause of death given on Annie's certificate is violent injuries to throat and abdomen by a sharp instrument, murder against some person or persons unknown. A leather apron was found under a tap in the yard of 29 Hanbury Street, and this belonged to a John Richardson, who was taken in by police and questioned. However, it had been there since the 6th of September, and it was there because his mother had washed it for him and she had left it out to dry. Now, the press reported on this extensively. And again, they reported that the murderer was a local Jew, Leather Apron. And the newspapers also began to report stinging criticism of the police, that they weren't doing the job and that they were allowing this to happen. But in their defence, they were trying. Along with the John Pfizer Leather Apron line of investigation, police also investigated several other men. A ship's cook who had been heard shouting misogynistic remarks, a soldier traced from a piece of envelope in which Annie Chapman had kept her tablets, a Swiss butcher who matched the description of a suspicious blood-stained man, a man with a bloody shirt who claimed he had been bitten by a dog, and a German hairdresser who tried to stab another man whilst he was drunk. But they were all cleared of suspicion. 3 days earlier, a letter written in red ink, dated the 25th of September 1888, had been received by the Central News Agency in London, and the letter read, "Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope, ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the ladies' ears off and send them to police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the ink off my hands, curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now, haha. On the 29th of September 1888, although it had initially been considered a hoax, the letter was handed over to the police. So this was how Jack the Ripper got his name, but it wouldn't catch on just yet. On the 30th of September 1888, Louis Deemschutz, accompanied by his cart and pony, headed into Dutfield's yard. The pony stopped at the entrance, refusing to proceed. The pony was clearly spooked, but in the pitch-black dark he couldn't see why. He held his whip out in front of him, prodding on the ground to see what it was, and soon found the cause of the pony's upset. There was a woman on the ground, either drunk or sleeping. He was unable to rouse the woman, and so he went into a local working man's pub, where two men, Isaac Kozabrodsky and Maurice Eagle, came to help him. However, the three men discovered that the woman was neither drunk or asleep. She had been killed. A Dr. Frederick Blackwell attended the scene and officially pronounced her dead at 1:16 a.m. And this lady was later identified as 44-year-old Elizabeth Stride. It's believed that Louis Deemschutz interrupted Jack the Ripper, almost catching him in the act, before he could carry out the mutilations. And it's also believed that Jack the Ripper was actually still in Dutfield's yard when Louis Deemschutz entered, standing maybe off to the corner in the shadows, and that when he left to go and get help to move the woman, he made his escape. And what a horrible, creepy thought, being alone in a dark yard with Jack the Ripper. I wonder what he would have done if he hadn't left. Police surgeon George Bagster Phillips also attended just a few minutes later. Elizabeth was transported to St George's mortuary, where he and Dr. Blackwell would jointly perform the post-mortem. Elizabeth was formally identified on the 3rd of October 1888 by a common-law partner, Michael Kidney. The inquest into Elizabeth's death began on the 1st of October 1888, and Dr. Phillips testified that the cause of death was, quote, undoubtedly the loss of blood from the left carotid artery and the division of the windpipe. Now, he believed that she had been grabbed by the shoulders and forced to the ground, and that the assailant had been kneeling at her right side when he cut her throat. The official cause of death listed on Elizabeth's death certificate is violent hemorrhage from the severance of blood vesicles in the neck by a sharp instrument. Murder against person or persons unknown. A man named Israel Swartz told the police that he had seen a man approximately 5'5", with a dark moustache and dark hair, push Elizabeth to the ground outside Dutfield's yard at approximately 12:45 a.m. However, he didn't testify at the inquest. Another man, James Brown, said that he saw Elizabeth rejecting the advances of a stout man in Fairclough Street, opposite Berner Street, at about the same time. There were no new suspects. Later that morning, as PC Edward Watkins was walking his beat, at approximately 1:44 a.m, saw a woman lying in the corner of Mitre Square. Local surgeon George William Sequeria was summoned, and he arrived at 1:55 a.m. and soon pronounced her dead. Police surgeon George Gordon Brown arrived minutes later, and it would be he who would go on to complete the post-mortem. Like the three women before her, her throat had been cut, and as was the case with mutilations increasing in severity from Polly Nichols to Annie Chapman, because the murderer wasn't interrupted, the mutilations had also increased in severity from Annie Chapman to this lady, who was later identified as 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes, and this time there were also facial injuries. A search of the area found a piece of Catherine's apron at the bottom of a staircase of a tenement in Gulston Street, and on the wall in chalk, written above it, was a message reading, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," and this has since become known as the Gulston Street graffiti. So this could have been a message left by the killer. It was found right next to the piece of Catherine's apron, but it was also not uncommon to see graffiti on the walls in this area of London, and so It may have been a coincidence, but some police officers believe that this could cause a problem because at the time there was a huge anti-Semitic sentiment. The City of London police wanted to photograph the graffiti, but Charles Warren, Police Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, ordered that this be scrubbed off because he feared that this would further fuel that anti-Semitic sentiment. So the words were copied down exactly by a policeman, and at 5 a.m. the graffiti was scrubbed clean. Now, Catherine Eddowes' death was slightly different to the others in that it had occurred in the City of London, and this meant that rather than only being investigated by the Metropolitan Police, the City of London Police became involved in the hunt for the murderer. So the inquest into Catherine Eddowes' death began on the 4th of October 1888. Police surgeon Frederick Brown testified that Catherine had died very quickly as a result of hemorrhaging of a carotid artery, resulting from a cut to her throat as she lay on the ground at approximately 1:40 and 1:50 a.m. The injuries had been inflicted after death with the same knife, approximately 6 inches long, with the perpetrator likely kneeling by her side. Now, because these mutilations had increased, I'm not going to go into detail in them, but Catherine's face had been mutilated, as had her abdomen, and her uterus and kidney had been removed. And along with the facial injuries, one of her earlobes had also been cut off. So Dr. Brown believed that this was the act of one person and that it would have taken approximately 5 minutes to complete. He also believed that the murderer must have had a great deal of knowledge as to the position of the abdominal organs and the way of removing them. However, Dr. Sequeria was of the opinion that the murderer was not possessed of any great anatomical skill. I think that's typical of this case. 2 men there at the same time. One thought that he had some anatomical knowledge and one thought that he didn't. The cause of death given on Catherine's death certificate was hemorrhage from the left carotid artery caused by being cut by a sharp instrument. Willful murder against some person unknown. So the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes are generally referred to as the double event. As Elizabeth's throat was cut but there had been no abdominal mutilations, it's believed that the killer was disturbed, probably by Deem shuts, before he had the chance to carry out the mutilations. And this is supported by the fact that Elizabeth was still warm when she was found. Some people believe that the extent of Catherine Eddowes' mutilations were caused by the anger at being disturbed after he had killed Elizabeth Stride. However, not everybody accepts this, and some point to the lack of mutilation as evidence that Elizabeth wasn't actually part of the Jack the Ripper series of murders. So remember the Dear Boss letter? And remember how it said there would be another murder soon? And remember how it said that the lady's ears would be clipped? Well, this letter hadn't been made public yet. Coincidence? It might be. And if the letter was a hoax, it probably was, but it's a scary coincidence. The day after the double event, on the 1st of October 1888, another piece of correspondence was delivered to the Central News Agency, this time a postcard smeared with blood. And this postcard read, "I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work. Tomorrow, double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get ears off for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper." Although this postcard was received after the deaths of Elizabeth and Catherine, some experts believe that it had been posted before the news of the murders were published. For the postcard to have been received by the Central News Agency on the 1st of October, it would have had to have been posted the day before on the 30th of September, which was the day of the murders. Given the timing of the murders, it was probably too late for the news of the murders to have been printed in that morning's newspapers. However, because the murders were committed so early in the morning, it's extremely likely that news of the murders had got out at some point in that day and had spread throughout London. So it's entirely possible that whoever did write the postcard had learned some of the details from police and perhaps from people who had been present at the scenes. However, they might not necessarily have known about the Dear Boss letter, unless they were linked to members of the press or the police. On the 3rd of October 1888, the police decided to make the Saucy Jack postcard and the Dear Boss letter public, in the hope that somebody might identify the handwriting. So the name Jack the Ripper, at this point, went public. On the 16th of October 1888, a package, postmarked the day before, was delivered to the home of Mr. George Lusk. Lusk was the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. The committee was a group of civilian men who patrolled the streets giving assistance to the police in the hope that they could protect women and find the killer. Mr. Lusk had been very vocal about his criticism of the police and the authorities in general. They believed that the police weren't doing enough to protect the residents and it was affecting the business. And so because of this criticism, he was often in the newspapers and was well known. This package contained some meat that smelled quite offensive, and it was accompanied by a letter addressed from hell, claiming to be from Jack the Ripper, which read, "I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate, it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if only you wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." So at first, like the Dear Boss letter, this was considered a hoax, but after discussing it with other members of the Vigilance Committee, it was handed over to the police. So as I said, this package was postmarked 15th of October 1888, which was 15 days after the double event, the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, and 11 days after the beginning of the inquest of Catherine Eddowes' death. So as the inquest were open to the public and had been reported on by the newspapers, it would have been known that her kidney was missing. And although it would have been possible for some members of society to have obtained a kidney to send to Mr. Lusk, that wasn't the case for the general public, who wouldn't have had access to a kidney or the skill to remove one. And the contents of the package had been examined by doctors who confirmed that it was the left kidney of a woman, and there are also some reports that it belonged to a woman with Bright's disease and had been taken within the last 3 weeks, although these claims were later refuted. On the 9th of November 1888, landlord John McCarthy sent his assistant, Thomas Bowyer, who was a retired soldier, to collect rent from one of his residents who was a few weeks behind, and that was Mary Jane Kelly, who rented a room from him in Miller's Court. Thomas Bowyer knocked on the door at about 10:45, and there was no answer. He knocked again. Still no answer. He tried the door, but it was locked. So he went around to the window. Now, a few days earlier, Mary Jane Kelly, who lived there, had had an argument with her former boyfriend, Joseph Barnett, and during the course of this argument, one of the panes of glass in the window had been smashed. And since then, Mary had been plugging the hole with a piece of cloth. So, thinking that Mary Jane might just be ignoring him, Thomas Bowyer pushed the cloth through the window and pulled the curtain to the side. And when he saw Mary Jane lying on the bed, it must have really shaken him. He returned to John McCarthy and reported what he had seen. Mary Jane was dead on a bed in the room. Now, whether he thought it was some kind of joke, McCarthy went to see for himself, and as soon as he sent Thomas Bowyer to report the crime to the police. He ran straight to the Commercial Street police station and reported the claim to Inspector Walter Beck. They returned to Miller's Court and police surgeon George Baxter Phillips was summoned. Beck, thinking on his feet, arranged to inform Scotland Yard. He arranged for sniffer dogs to attend in the hopes that they would be able to trace the killer, and he also ordered that nobody should enter or leave the yard. News spread like wildfire and a huge crowd gathered outside, and this crowd were not happy. They were shouting abuse at the police, angry that they had allowed this to happen again. Initially they couldn't get in because it was said that the door was locked, which is odd, isn't it? Because did Jack the Ripper just lock the door when he left? What makes this even more odd is that Mary Jane's boyfriend, Joseph Barnett, told the police that the key to the door had been lost. So who had locked the door? Well, this might be another falsehood in the case, because I've also read that the door wasn't in fact locked and that it was a heavy wash basin in a frame that had been pushed against the door, and that was preventing the door from being opened. Now, this could also be a bit odd because if he had pushed it up against the door and forcing the door closed, how had he got out? The only explanation I can think to that is that, and I don't know what the setup was, he perhaps climbed out of the window, drawing the curtain behind him and putting the fabric back in the pane of glass. It was decided that the bloodhounds probably weren't going to be able to trace the murderer, and they were sent away. Then at 1:30 p.m, Superintendent Thomas Arnold from H Division ordered that the door should be broken in. and 2 crime scene photographs were taken in the room, which was a relatively new thing to do at the time. And I've also heard that photographs were taken of Mary Jane Kelly's eyes because it was believed that the last image she seen would be preserved in her retina. So as I said, there were 2 crime scene photographs taken in Mary Jane Kelly's room, and as with the others, I'm not going to show these on here. If you want to see them, they are online, but all of the photographs I find very disturbing. If you've ever read any books about Jack the Ripper though, you've probably seen them already. They are generally in those books. The mutilations inflicted upon Mary Jane were the worst so far, and it's believed that this is because, as she was killed in a room, there was no risk of anybody coming by to disturb him, and he could just take his time and do whatever it was that he wanted to do. Mary Jane's body was taken to the Shoreditch mortuary, and she was identified there by her former boyfriend Joseph Barnett, although he was only able to identify her by her eyes and one of her ears. And Mary Jane Kelly was examined, and Dr. Thomas Bond's documents relating to the examination can be found. They haven't been lost. I'm just going to read you a few quotes from these documents just to give you an idea of the extent of the injuries. The whole surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of the features. The tissues of the neck were severed all around down to the bone. The uterus, kidney, and 1 breast had been placed under her head, the other breast by her right foot, and the liver between the feet. The intestines were on her right side, and the spleen by the left. The flaps removed from the abdomen and thighs were on a table. It goes on, but I think that's enough to give you a picture of just how vicious this was. As with the other women, it's believed that Mary Jane had been killed before the mutilations were inflicted. Small mercies. Bond also stated that the knife used to inflict these injuries was 1 inch wide and a minimum of 6 inches long, and he agreed with Dr. Sequeria in that he didn't believe that the assailant had any medical knowledge or training, or even the knowledge of a butcher or slaughterer. The inquest was opened on the 12th of November 1888. Joseph Barnett testified that he and Mary Jane had lived together until the 30th of October 1888 when they had split, but they had remained on good terms. Bond gave the post-mortem findings and testified that he believed that she had died between 2 a.m. and 8 a.m. on the 9th of November 1888. The cause of death given on Mary Jane's death certificate, dated the 17th of November 1888, reads, "Severance of right carotid artery, willful murder against some person or persons unknown, violent." Her name was given as Marie Jeanette Kelly, otherwise Davies. Joseph Barnett was questioned by Inspector Frederick Aberline for 4 hours, and his clothes were inspected for blood. Joseph told him that he had provided for Mary Jane and that they had lived together, most recently in Miller's Court. He had been employed as a porter in Billingsgate Fish Market. However, when he lost his job and there was no longer any income coming in, Mary Jane had resorted to walking the streets, and Joseph wasn't happy about that. And this is what led to the split. Joseph Barnett was completely exonerated. Inspector Aberline also put a lot of weight into the testimony given by a witness who came forward after Mary Jane Kelly's inquest, and that was George Hutchinson. And George Hutchinson had approached the police on the 12th of November 1888, advising them that he had seen Mary Jane Kelly with a man on the night before her murder. And Aberline even went so far as to walk through the streets of Whitechapel with George Hutchinson in the hope that they would identify the man he had seen Mary Jane with, but unfortunately he never did. There have been countless men accused of being Jack the Ripper over the years, some at the time and some more recently after new evidence or so-called evidence has come to light. In fact, there are over 100 names, and these range from Queen Victoria's grandson, the Duke of Clarence, Dr. Bernardo, Lewis Carroll, and Charles Cross, the man who found the first victim, Polly Nichols. The people who find murder victims are often suspected. And I get it, you can see it, can't you, if it was him. Oh, look what I found. So it's possible. Any of them are possible. In fact, anybody living in the East End of London, or the West End of London, or within commuting distance of London, it's possible that they were Jack the Ripper. And Joseph Barnett, who, despite being exonerated, he remains a suspect on the basis that he was angry with Mary Jane for going back to walk in the streets. It's been over 135 years now, and this case is firmly a part of our culture. There are books, films, TV shows, video games even, where you can play as the Jack the Ripper character, if you don't know why you'd want to. And there are tours of the East End, the murder locations of the victims. Every new suspect that comes to light seems to attract a headline. Almost everybody has heard of Jack the Ripper, and if asked, everybody will be able to tell you something. In the next video, I'll be talking about the setting for the murders, the East End slums, and the grim conditions that people lived in at the time. Mould, vermin, disease, unimaginable to us here in 2024. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.